Now, with that in mind, let's come even closer. Here we see some what I call 18th century theorization. Facts for say, there and Dutal. There's the plan of several branches, primarily attributable to Forsay. That he wanted variation in his plan. In other words, gives him the idea of trying to get at that sort of vulnerability. And plan of several branches. Mobility, fluidity of force, they all thought about it. Cohesion. Pull all these things together and you play the so-called dispersion concentration game. I'll show you later on how Napoleon played the dispersion concentration game. He did it in a particular manner. We'll be looking into it and setting it up. Another notion here, primarily attributable to the person who brought it out, they were doing it a little harder. Operating a line or operating direction to threaten alternative objectives. In other words, what you want to do is put your force and go between alternative objectives, the idea being. The other guy doesn't know what you're going to go for, so he breaks his force out. The last moment, then, you take your force operating against a fraction of his. It's the way of getting strength against weakness. In other words, put your adversary in the horns of the dilemma. Basic idea. I'll also point out, Little Hart didn't even understand his own idea. I'll bring that up later on. He actually drew that idea from Borsay and also from Sherman's operations in the South during the Civil War. He drew it from, he admits that, he puts that right up front. And then another notion here, concentrate direct artillery fire on key points of the force. They didn't have much indirect in it. The idea is to concentrate it, and then of course you get a rupture, and then you go through and roll them up on the flanks and the rear. And of course the action statements here. Napoleon was familiar with all these people. Let them read it. And note the key idea here, Napoleon. Ambiguity, deception, and rapid, easy movement. These are the input in order to achieve surprise as an output. By having ambiguity, deception, quickness, or speed, those are the kind of things you put those together. That's the ingredients through which you get your surprise. Now, very often in military literature, you see them describe deception and speed. They hardly ever mention ambiguity. And I'll show you later on, ambiguity may be even more important than deception. For certain ways, it's more important, more powerful, more leverage. I can tell you what it is now. We're going to bring that out. I hide it. We want to get some more information. We'll bring that out. Why I make it a statement. And then, of course, guerrillas, in more informal ways, exploited these same notions. Less formality in order to leverage your adversary. But there's another way you can interpret this chart. Plan in several branches. You can take that as a form of variety. Rapidity, cohesion is form of harmony. Dispersion, concentration, another form of variety. Operating a line to threaten alternative objectives. Harmony plus variety. So knowing that, let's leave the top of this alone, rewrite the action statements here. Doesn't mean that these statements are incorrect. I just want to give you a richer view. So the top's the same, and all I've done is rewritten the action statement. And if you check on the negative side, you see the power. You use these things to generate certain things, but if you substitute variety and harmony for uniformity, then what happens? You become less adaptable, more predictable. That's what Napoleon did. Time went on. Lost his ability to adapt, became more predictable, adversary were able to use it again. It's only a very general statement. We're going to pin that down. We'll talk about Napoleon. And once again, so the impression I want to leave you with then, with all these gentlemen, Sun Tzu, Schalk, Forsay, etc., those ideas at home with either regular or guerrilla work. Now, why do I make that point? Because very often we like to draw very sharp distinctions between regular warfare and guerrilla warfare on the other hand. That's not too useful, because remember, there's many notions are similar in both. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you both regular warfare and guerrilla warfare. We'll keep track and show you how one interconnects with the other to come forward. Sometimes we draw very sharp distinctions and we get lost, so to speak. We don't want to get lost. I think it'd be a good time to take about a 5-minute break. We'll come back to the point to do that. If you want to take about a 5-minute break, we'll come back. Because the only way you really generate any of these options, so I'm in the design business, you have to take you have to put assumptions in your math, your algorithms, and that, and there's other things you leave out because they're hard to measure. But just because it's hard to measure doesn't mean it isn't important. If we have some of our science engineering meetings, well, I can't measure it. Because you can't measure it, it's unimportant. You know it's important. Well, and you know, why are we making this so optimal? If that's important, it's not included. How do we know it's optimal?
Independent something in charge. Yes.
Okay, here's where we left off. Let's go right to the next part. Now what I want to do is I want to talk into the one. What we're going to look at next, what I call the three giants of the 19th century. First, Napoleon, the super practitioner. Next, Clausewitz, the philosopher on war. And next, Jomini, sometimes called the system mind on war. You might say, and for a couple of reasons. One, they had a very pervasive influence upon the way we look at war and conflict. In other words, things are inculcated, and this just came out of their time in a very pervasive way. Not all good. In other words, maybe hanging on to some images and views that are causing us difficulty. When you have images or views that are causing difficulty, you might want to get new images or views. Otherwise, you have a prescription for defeat. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why the communists have done so well against them is not because they're so clever, it's because we've been acting like mastodons. Not a doubt. Got to keep that in mind. I want you to keep that in mind. We don't want to overthrow certain traditional values, obviously. We don't want to retain those things that are going to destroy us. Okay, with that in mind, I want to look at these three people. And as I already said, because they have very pervasive influence, we want to get to see what that pervasive influence is. Maybe get some insight as to maybe how we can think of it. Okay, with that in mind, first Napoleon, super practitioner. When you look at Napoleon, you have to remember when he came on the scene, there were certain things that were already available for what I call the Revolutionary Army gifts to Napoleon, right here in his Art of War. First of all, we're talking about the period of the Revolution. In other words, the peasants are going to get a piece of the action instead of being robots or nuggets for somebody else's enterprise. So they're morally, spiritually, have all kinds of energy, dynamism. In other words, they want to play. So you have that going for you. You want to use that. Second, the so-called subdividing an army into self-sustaining components. Today we call it the divisional concept. It showed up at that time. It showed up even before Napoleon. The so-called divisional concept. Why is that important? Think of two armies clashing together here, like I'm doing with my hand. Then you have one that separates out into divisions, the intervals in between. They can get at the flanks from here and literally pull the other army apart. Because very adaptive, very quick. Of course, you have to have a good commander to do that. Remember, Napoleon was a good commander. Third, vote this one. Here I'm in essence saying poverty is a virtue. Instead of depending upon these heavy resupply columns, resupply efforts, they're living off the land. So they move at a much faster tempo or much faster pace. So from that viewpoint, revolutionary armies operate at a very fast pace. And in that sense, poverty was a virtue. This one you see very often in the literature. The so-called rapid march associated with 120 versus the sometimes called the revolutionary quick step, Napoleon quick step, 120 versus 70 steps per minute. The reason why I put those quotations around it, I'm not sure I believe that. You know, it's like a contractor's brochure. Just because it's in there doesn't mean it's true. The point is, the idea is correct. Whether it's 120 or something else, the point is if you loosen people up, they can operate at a faster tempo or pace. You keep them tight, it's more difficult to do so. So whether the numbers are correct or not, the basic idea is correct. And the idea of the discontinued adherence to the so-called 1791 drill regulations. The regulations would prescribe the use of line and column for fighting and for movement and evolutions between one and the other. The idea means you get some kind of leverage over your adversary. They initially came out in 1788. They were modified, came out in their final form in 1791, and lasted until 1830, 1831, for a 40-year period. In other words, they were in effect before Napoleon and were in effect after Napoleon. But there was a period there where they didn't adhere to them. Get to that. And so if you pull all this together, here's the advantage you get over your adversary if he hasn't done these kinds of things. In other words, you get a mobility of force is much better than your adversary. And it raises a rather important question, particularly with respect to Napoleon. How did he exploit this superior mobility fluidity of force? Because his warfare is characterized with mobility, fluidity, quickness, etc. So how did he exploit that? We're going to get into that right now. Let's dive into that. So I want you to look at this chart here. Little snapshot of what I call an aspect of his board. Well, sorry, I'll move it over. We'll pull the right side over after look at the left side. Fairly busy chart here. The general features: plan of resolution, security, strategic dispersion, attack concentration, and vigorous offensive action. I'll let you read it, and then I'll comment on it on the left side. Don't read the right side. I'll get that. Okay, let's look at the first bullet here. Know what's going on here, all these kinds of things he's doing. The idea is to find out what his adversary is not up to so he can kind of by hypothesis figure out what he's up to. In other words, the basis for not only simplifying his own way he operates, but also removing uncertainty with respect to his adversary. In other words, sort of an inverse Forsage. Know his ideas on security, all the different kinds of things he's doing. The key idea is to cloak or mask his movement vis-a-vis his adversary. So he's doing all these kinds of things. Indicated. So in that sense, you can think of the security as being a chain for his vigorous offensive, which is his chief. Ways to do thought. Some other ways you can think of it. Now, note this third bullet here, which I've depicted as strategic dispersion and tactical concentration. For you people who have read the Napoleonic literature, you usually see it described differently. They'll describe it as assembly and concentration. Then you have a hard time. What do they mean the difference between assembly and concentration? When you read into it, you find out what he's doing initially, keeping his forces spread out with intervals in between. As they start closing down, they start to get tactical concentration. So it's an initial strategic dispersion followed by a tactical concentration. In other words, you get a sharper distinction, a better way of describing it. Know what's happening here, describe it. They have these large intervals, they start closing in and get a better picture, then the large fraction of their force pounds upon a small fraction of their adversary. In other words, a way of getting strength against weakness. Plus the fact that their very movements here, irregular and rapid fashion, it adds another notion of security. In other words, it acts as a cloaking or masking or amorphous kind of movement too. Hard to keep track of. Remember, if you think back to OODA, you don't get a good observation, your orientation's screwed up, your orientation's screwed up, your decision's screwed up, your decision's screwed up, your action's screwed up. So if you screw a guy's observations up, then you've corrupted his OODA. And once you've got that corrupted, you got things working your way. And then the fourth point, the idea of a vigorous offense. Basically what it was to grab the initiative and have his adversary not react quick enough so he's a step or two inside them and gradually pulling their adversary apart. We can't cope, can't keep up, not adapt, and start coming like glue. Okay? Now, his theme with respect to those general features, the idea of using what you see very often in literature, a single or unified line of operation. Now, don't think of it as a line per se in a map, some people do. What you really think of in terms of a line, remember these units are spread out adjacently and also longitudinally. It's a line only in the sense they're trying to operate in a concerted or coordinated manner. Only in that sense, like a line of reasoning. You know, you get different kinds of things, but that doesn't mean you're a party line. But that doesn't mean if you're trying to do things along a very narrow or rigid line. Now, very often it's depicted that way. It's unfortunate use of words, but that's what's done. So don't think of it that way. You think of many lines which are operating in a concerted way, so in that sense, it's a single line or a line of operation when you read that literature. The other thing is the idea is to try to grab your adversary's communication. Basic idea by doing that is to cut his line of communication, seize his line of communication, isolate his forces. But he can't get resupplied, he can't get reinforcements. Also, to force him to fight under unfavorable circumstances. Plus, think of it yourself. If you're in a force, you get cut off, kind of blundered. talking about very human kinds of things. Then, as a result, that employ a fraction of your force in order to divert, grab his attention, and hold him down. Then, the other portion of your force to go into his flank, go into his center, in order to pull him apart, whatever is the weak or vulnerable point. So you begin to see here, this is a chain and chi. There's your chain, there's your chi. You see it right there. You have a chain and chi operation there. I might add at this point, Sun Tzu was translated into French in Paris in 1772 and later on again in 1782 by the Jesuits, which revealed two things. The Chinese suspected the Jesuits were spies, and they were. And two, the other point is, it's very often suggested, no proof, people think that Napoleon did read Sun Tzu's Art of War. And you look at some of his operations, they have some of that character, but we really don't know. They haven't been uncovered at this day. But there is some suspicion because he read so many things military at that particular time. And the next point here, note this, set up supporting centers or base of operations, local depots. Well, they didn't have formal bases, they have formal resupply efforts. What they would do as they conquer territory and set up and forage an area, they'd set up local depots or local bases of operations. They would set them up such that they'd have alternative lines of communication. They wouldn't only have one line of communication, but alternative. So they have one cut off, they can appeal to another one for resupply. You see what that does, that frees up their freedom of maneuver, frees up their action, it gives them leverage against their adversary, also makes them more unpredictable. More uncertain, though. In any case, his aim is quite simple. Destroy enemy army. Remember what I said earlier. Terrain doesn't wage wars, machines don't wage wars, people do want to use their mind. He's onto a partial truth here. He recognized if you take out the army, then you own the terrain. If you go up the terrain, you have to fight the army again and again. So in that sense, he was correct. Didn't have it all. If you look at his operations down in Spain, remember, he destroyed the Spanish army, then he had to fight the guerrillas and lost the guerrillas. So it's not only the formal instruments you have to fight, you also have to fight the what? Informal instruments. Or the irregular, whether it be guerrillas, people, dirty tricks, whatever it might be. Or today we have terrorists, all that kind of thing. That's the problem. But he did have a partial truth. But he tended to think of it more of a formal instrument, as they did back in the latter part of the 18th century, early part of the 19th century. We see that now. But note these operations up here. I'll show you some schematics here for you. Tie them up in one direction, hose them over here. Chain and two. Let me show you a schematic, and what I call an idealized schematic. Okay, and I lifted this right out of the book as indicated at the bottom here. The only thing I added is the chain and chi. And what we see is what we call a strategy envelopment. Here's a pinning force here. Here's a maneuver force. Comes back, cuts off the lines of communication, folds in behind it. They put the pressure on, pull the guy apart.
Well, that was by me again.
Okay, you have a pinning force here. Tie up your adversary. The gravity attention force in direct. Anytime you go down this maneuver force comes in the back door here, cuts off his lines of communications, as one move, a part of the force, the rest of it folds back in. So these people can't interfere. So now they have to see these people isolated. So as they try to adjust this, these other people put more pressure on in order to pull your adversary apart. In other words, they're trying to adjust under very trying circumstances.
What battle is that? Is that one?
No, this is just a method that you would apply over and over again in many battles, different ways. You see that kind of thing. That's one notion. I'm just trying to depict the chain and the chi operation. You know, remember Patton said, hold him by the nose, kick him in the rear. You're holding him by the nose, kick him in the rear. Okay, another operation called the strategy of central position. If his adversary was spread out a little bit, or two forces there, with large interval in between, he would strike into that interval, and then set in what he calls an SA, a secondary attack here, to keep these people tied up, use a major portion of his force in order to grab these people and try to defeat them, and then after he did it, swing back to the other force. Well, that sounds nice and dandy, but there's a hidden assumption there. You're not going to get away with that unless you can operate at a faster tempo or pace than your adversary. That's not explicitly in that diagram. You've got to remember, there's a hidden assumption there. Providing you can operate at a faster tempo or pace, you can do that. Remember, the Mongols did that kind of stuff, too. But if you're operating slow, then you're not going to be able to play that game. Okay? Okay, with that in mind, now let's step down to his tactics. And what I'm showing you here, early example of an example of his early tactics, and an example of his later tactics here. And they were so beautifully stated, I thought I would just take the quotes. The underlines are mine for emphasis. Now, I'll let you read both these, then I'll comment on it. For your information, both years mean charge years or skirmish. In any case, I'll let you read it and I'll comment. Read the left and then read the right, I want to comment. One other point. Remember, this didn't happen all of a sudden. Over time, shifted to this kind of a mode. Okay? Let's look at the left-hand side. These two underlines really, or literally, capture the essence of the statement. Note this, a general rather than minutely regulated mission. If you have a general rather than minutely regulated, what happens? If you have a minutely regulated, you lose your ability to adapt, you become very predictable. It's hard to change. General mission, you become more adaptable, less predictable. That's the key idea there. And with that more adaptable, less predictable, then you can start exploiting his so-called the chinks in his armor. In other words, exploit his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities. Now let's go to the right side. Heavy bombardment, you're attacking his strength. Fashion away. Not only that, note that. The secret is careful timing and coordinate. You're on a confusion and conflict, you have everything carefully timed. Yeah, nice. Most often isn't done, even when you want to do it. So now you're putting up a situation, you have careful timing in a very confused situation. It's a very difficult thing to do. Another guy, remember, he's adjusting to you too. So the point is, here we see heavy bombardment going strength against strength. You got these very carefully timed, more minutely regulated missions, which means you become less adaptable, more predictable. But the only way you can do that, you have to put yourself to do very predictable things at lower and lower levels right now. In any case, that's my essential point. Fluid and adaptable on the left, less fluid, less adaptable on the right. More unpredictable on the left, more predictable on the right. So we see the evolution of his tactics over time taking place. So, let's critique that. Obviously, there's some questions related to that. Why? Begin the answer here. So when you look at Napoleon, begin to critique, you find out he did exploit ambiguity deception below the strategic level. He did a beautiful work all the way up to Waterloo. Unfortunately, on the tactical level, he started going back to what I call more formal battering ram methods. As a matter of fact, he reinstalled the 1791 drill regulation, and even in a very heavy-handed fashion. Why? Napoleon emphasized the conduct of war from the top down. He wanted to get strategic success, initial strategic success, to gain grand tactical and tactical. And to do that, he set up what we call a highly centralized command and control system, as indicated here, where he kept the grand design in his mind. His own marshals and generals didn't know what that was. Now, why would somebody do that? Because it gives them control over his inferiors, so they can't deviate too far. Otherwise, they'll blow the whole thing apart. It's a control mechanism. Well, if they know that, and they're going to get in trouble, what are they going to do? Typically, they just pass that right down the chain of command. Any organization does that, so you get more rigid, less fluid, lower and lower level. And the result's not too surprising. The strategic maneuvers, even though they're very gifted, after concentration, your tactical maneuvers become, no, I put quotes around maneuvers, there we go, stereotype conflict. Hence, it became very difficult as time went on to gain that tactical victory. secure that capital efficiency. Let me give you an example where they didn't adapt. In Spain, for example, Wellington, when he went against Napoleon's forces, one of his favorite schemes was to put his troops on a reverse slope with a heavy skirmisher screen. Well, if you put it on a reverse slope, then, you just kind of observe how they're deployed or arrayed against you. Plus, that's one thing. So if observation-wise, you have a disadvantage. The other point is, it's very difficult for you to savage them, so to speak, with your own artillery on reverse slope. Plus the heavy skirmishers. With a skirmisher screen, then you can see what Napoleon was up to. Well, what happened when you come over the slope, correct, they'd be ready for him to beat the hell out of him when they come over the slope. Guess what? Same technique Wellington used against him at Waterloo later on. The point is, Napoleon didn't adapt. Still using the same assault formation. Same kind of repeatability. Just keep that in mind. So partial, critique, so forth. We'll actually make it more involved after we look at Clausewitz and Jomini. Remember, Clausewitz and Jomini came out in the Napoleonic period. In a sense, they were trying to articulate the type of warfare that Napoleon was trying to wage. In any case, the point. Strategic fall followed by stereotype ruinous tactical assaults. In other words, I give him credit at the strategic level, not going to fit down to the tactical level, because the route becomes obvious, less adaptive, more quick. You see that. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at Clausewitz, the philosopher of war. And what we find out, he dwelled very heavily on the character and nature of war. And he comes up with the same statement. War is an active policy to use violence to impose one's will upon another. In other words, you think about that, you recognize you have an opponent you're working against, not just some inanimate object. Matter of fact, he makes the point. Dual or active human interaction directed against an animate object that reacts. You're not sure. And if you don't know that, that adds what he calls uncertainty. Uncertainty of information acts as an impediment to vigorous activity. In other words, if you're uncertain, you have doubt, it acts as an impediment to activity. And he describes some of those things that add to that. Psychological aspects of uncertainty. Psychological moral forces. Describes three kinds: danger, intelligence, you're describing mental, and emotional factors. The emotional factors describes two kinds: doubt, fear, anxiety, being what he calls the negative kind, what he calls their positive or noble counterweights: courage, confidence, and esprit. And he says, you don't know which way that's going to go one way or the other, so it can either impede or stimulate. One day they may appeal to one, the other day they may appeal to another. Then he does a very interesting thing. All these activities interact with many factors, including all these above, which throws in complexity, lack of knowledge, etc., that tends to impede war. He calls that friction. Friction interacts with many factors that impedes activity. And then he makes a very famous statement. He says, friction is the only concept that more or less corresponds to those factors that distinguish real war from war on paper. The only concept that distinguishes real war from war on paper. The point is, if you don't account for the idea of friction, you're talking about something other than war. You should look at some of the computer models they're dependent on. We don't even think about it. And then they wonder why the models don't play out as well. Because they don't bring in the human factor. When you're dealing with the human factor, you're dealing with friction. Even in the physics, particularly human beings. Then he goes on to state, the climate or atmosphere of war is friction. And it's a thread that goes through all this treaty. Some people don't pick it up, and if you read it, you see it. It shows up again and again. As a matter of fact, in a sense what it is, it's precursor to a modern concept of what I call the second law of thermodynamics. And you've heard the term, many of you. Entropy. Friction and entropy, same kind of thing. And if you look at the way he states, the way he uses it, you look at the way they talk about the modern second law, Very, very simple. Very powerful notion. Very important notion. Then he says, how can you overcome this friction? He says, really, one best way is by experience. Another one is having a particularly brilliant commander, whether it be Alexander, Napoleon, etc. And he says, if you have that brilliant commander, he describes him as a genius for war. Those people that can overcome that friction and deal with that complexity. And if you have that individual, he changes the nature and magnifies the scope of operation. He can't change the character of war, but he can certainly do that. And then his strategy related to energy. Note this, he exhausts energy by employing him to increase expenditure revenue. Keep that in mind. And note this one, another very important concept. Seek out those centers of gravity upon which the other guy's movements, what he does, depends upon. And try to make trace them back to as few as possible. Ideally one, if you can find that one center of gravity and go after that one. And then to drive that point home, he said, in this activity, compress all effort against those centers into the fewest possible actions, ideally one again. And he shoves it one more time. Subordinate all minor or secondary actions in all this activity. What's his point? What he's trying to do, these are very much in harmony with his idea in friction. He's trying to reduce his own internal friction to deal with his adversary. And then we already described his importance of speed. Also, go after the major battle. Will promise a decisive victory. What he calls the decisive battle. And his aim is very simple. In his own words, render the enemy powerless for defense. With emphasis on destruction of his armed forces. That wasn't the only way, but that was the emphasis. Destruction of his armed forces. Another way is to grab a piece of territory. Another way was to destroy his will. He emphasized destruction of his armed forces. Good question.
It sounds like equal distribution. Go against centers, and then
No. He said, find what you do is look at his centers, find that one center that describes more than anything else, and go after that one center, using the fewest possible, ideally one. Then he says, compress all effort against those centers in the fewest possible actions, ideally one. Know what you're saying? One more. Then he said, subordinate all minor secondary actions as much as possible. In a sense, if you look at that, you could call that concentration. Remember, he's going against few centers, few actions. That's what we're talking about. And some people interpret straight concentration. They don't read the richness of this comment. As a result, they don't see into it. A better word would be focus. You're trying to get a focus. Concentration isn't for anything. Focus is a better for making focus. You'll see we'll use that later on. We'll work our way through. Okay, with that in mind now, you're onto something there. Let's critique Napoleon. Clausewitz. If we critique Clausewitz, we note that for one thing, he tended to overemphasize, overplay the idea of decisive battle, tended to underplay strategic maneuver. And you can understand why, for the time to remember, he actually, in a sense, was reacting against that 18th century warfare where they tried to do all these elegant maneuvers and they made no decision. So, somewhat of an overreaction. The other thing, Clausewitz emphasized method routine at the tactical level. As a matter of fact, he had a chapter on method routine. And he wanted to tackle them in his own words to reduce his own internal friction. His own words. Why? Clausewitz was very much concerned with trying to overcome or reduce friction and uncertainty. Unfortunately, he didn't turn the argument around. He failed to address the idea, why not try to magnify your adversary's friction and uncertainty? It's not that the former is wrong, you want to look at it both ways. Remember, if you reduce your own, and you're not looking at his, you may also help your adversary too, relative to you. You got to look at it both ways all the time. Clausewitz was also concerned with trying to exhaust his adversary by employing him to increase expenditure. Once again, he didn't turn that argument around. He failed to address the idea, why not try to paralyze your adversary by denying him even the opportunity to expend any of it? Now we see a difference between he and Sun Tzu. Clausewitz, in a sense, was trying to keep himself from being driven bananas. Sun Tzu was trying to drive his adversary bananas. Or using Clausewitz's term, Clausewitz was trying to reduce his own friction uncertainty, whereas Sun Tzu was concentrating on trying to magnify his adversary's friction uncertainty. As a matter of fact, you read Sun Tzu, he's doing both, worrying about his own plus his adversaries. And it's richer in that sense. I mean, he didn't use the word friction, but the idea is there. Friction is Clausewitz's word. And then Clausewitz made an incorrect statement. Quote, the center of gravity is always found where the mass is concentrated most densely. That's not always true. The center of gravity in a dome, it's in a hole. There is no mass. Or in a hollow steel ball, it's where the steel isn't. Or in a dumbbell, it's in the connection between the two masts. They come up with all kinds of counterexamples. And somebody said, wait a minute here, that might be a cheap shot. He might not appeal to that definition. That's strict. That's correct. But let's look and see how he did appeal. And then he argued that is where the place, then he failed. Then he argued that's where the blow should be, where the decision should be reached, at the center of gravity. But then he gave 3 examples of centers of gravity: the Army, the Capitol, and public opinion. He followed up the Army and Capitol, didn't follow up in public opinion. That was a mistake. Because public opinion depends upon what? The connections one against the other. That's the thing you people deal with. And if you disrupt those connections, you generate many non-cooperative centers of gravity. And that's my point. He failed to develop the idea of generating many non-cooperative centers of gravity by striking at those connections that permit a larger center of gravity to exist. He didn't follow up. So it raised a rather interesting question. What does all this mean? I made this big argument. Where the hell am I going? So let's invert the argument. Once again, very often you get insight when you invert. So once again, let's invert the argument. So let's assume that we can generate many non-cooperative centers of gravity in our adversary system. If we can do that, then we deprive him of the opportunity to expend effort. That's the same thing with paralysis. If we paralyze him, we impede vigorous operations. That's the definition of friction. We magnify friction. So if we can generate many non-cooperative centers of gravity in the system, we deprive him the opportunity to operate in a directed way, which paralyzes him, which impedes vigorous activity, which defines friction, magnifies friction. That's the key. You need to draw a real good connection between friction and centers of gravity. And we saw blank blank. In any case, if you paste all that together, here's the message. So then it makes, then pretty soon things begin to see what happens. If you're trying to have your methods, routine the same, the other guy's the same, pretty soon you get these nice, well-regulated battles and strength going against strength. It's a bloodbath. Depending on how you interpret it. You want to read into these very carefully. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at Jomini. Jomini lived a long time, born in 1779, died in 1869 after the Civil War. And he wrote his treatise, The Art of War, in 1836, also 1836, 1838. And around 1861, we find these comments where he's describing the ideas he had in mind when he wrote that. I'll let you read it. These are Jomini's words. So you see the Battle of White grabbed his attention. He saw some important idea there. Also, later, early on in Rewritten, he cut right back to the victories of Frederick and also times the victories of Napoleon himself. Trying to get leverage your adversary. So then, with this in mind, let's break out his Art of War in that context. Or we sort of have this notion and key idea he had in mind, so we outline his Art of War. We do it. We do it in 1836. His key idea was to generalize the oblique order associated battles of Lutheran slaves. And then he said in your mind's eye you want to divide the front or the theater up into three parts, and subdivide. 2 wings in the center. Or he said, not so ideally, 2 wings, or 2 wings on left and right center. In other words, it's a mental mechanism so you can kind of determine how you want to allocate the forces relative to your adversary so you can gain that leverage. And the key idea, gain leverage in terms of what? Those moves of like and strategic and grand tactical maneuvers. That's what he's trying to do. And then he recognized the importance of your lines of communication, your bases and your lines of operation, lines of communication. He said, you want to set up your bases of operations such that you can shape and shift your operation. In other words, so you can feed these strategic grand tactical maneuvers, so you can gain leverage over your adversary. So he said you can set up your base accordingly in order to try to do that. But you people know, in a physical sense, he's talking about what? A support base. In politics, you have to have a support base on it. In anything, you have to have a support base. He's talking about a physical support base. Okay, so if you pull these things together, then we begin to see strategy and grand tactics. Note this statement: by free and rapid movement, carry buffalo forces against fraction of the adversary. So you see the idea of speed, you see the idea of strength against weakness. Then he said, strike in the most decisive direction, go against the center or one wing or both simultaneously. I have to caveat this because I'm talking about two aspects, strategy and grand tactics. If you're operating a large strategic arena, you can go against the center or one wing, but not both simultaneously, because otherwise you may be defeated separately in detail. But if you're up in a grand tactical sense, you're in smaller regions, then you go against one or the other or both, because you have the time and ability to adapt. Okay, and then note this, straight Napoleon, if possible, grab his communication. Also, he said, without losing your own. The idea is to cut him off, deny him reinforcement, cause him to fight under unfavorable circumstances. Straight Napoleon. Remember, he was a Napoleonic general. And note this one, if the enemy's forces are too much extended, remember Napoleon's central position, split them up, take out one, then the other. And note this one, it's like that, hold them by the nose, take them in the rear. Go out flank and turn a wing, hit the enemy in the flank, and also contain them at the front. Both of them the nose, take them in the rear. Now this last one I want to comment on. Note this, an attack being made simultaneously on both extremities, but not inferior to your adversary. There's too many counterexamples to that. We've already cited a couple of them. Cannae, Marathon, Napoleon at Dresden. He was outnumbered by his adversary, did a double envelopment scheme, he succeeded. So that really doesn't hold up. Then, in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, it does hold up. Unfortunately, he didn't make it clear what he was speaking. Basically, what he was doing, he was comparing a double envelopment or double outflanking versus single envelopment, single outflanking versus loop or lightning. And basically, what he really meant to say was, look at, with the same force, I can get more leverage out of a single envelopment scheme than I can with a double envelopment. Or I can afford to lose less force with a single envelopment scheme, and I get the same effect I would out of a double envelopment with a larger force. They're equivalent statements. And we'll see later on the Germans and many of the Blitzkrieg activities, particularly Manstein and some of the others, were very gifted in terms of interpreting and using that. And then he said to make evidence, his aim was to make evidence a secret for success more. It wasn't literally a secret. All he's trying to do is give you a way of dealing with this complex activity, what's going on and how you can deal with it so you can cope and adapt. Okay, with that in mind, let's take Jomini. He was very much preoccupied with the form of operations, arrangement of bases, formal orders of battle, etc. That's not so good. What does that do? You tend to become less adaptable, more predictable. Rigidity begins to creep. Also, we have a lack of appreciation for the use of swarms of guerrillas and skirmishers. In fact, you tend to put them down. Comments on it. What they tend to do, in other words, to mask your own activity and also to confuse and disorder the enemy. And the likely result, operations become stereotyped unless you can appreciate its ideas outside their formal underpinning. Now, if you take those formal underpinnings and pull them away, then there's some nice fluidity and adaptability in those operations. But if you tend to retain that, then you tend to be less adaptable, more predictable. In other words, throw away the lattice work. After you create the picture, you don't leave the lattice there in order to screw up the picture. Same thing. That's it. Well, if you've been following me, you've been tracking what I've been saying about Napoleon, Clausewitz, and now Jomini, you should have detected something. They all, in a sense, had the same blind spot. If you look at all three. All three of them did not appreciate the importance of loose, irregular tactical arrangements, lower-level arrangements. Loose, irregular. Remember, Clausewitz, worried about method routine. Napoleon, 1791 drill regulations, Clausewitz method routine, and now we see Jomini, some of the same track. Why did they have this blind spot? Because all three of them tended to view the conduct of war from top down, emphasizing adaptability at the top and regularity at the bottom. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, an Army colonel got up and said, boy, that's all wrong. You don't have it right. That's an incorrect statement. Proceed. You have beautiful straight men. Nice what he did. He said, because today we have regularity at both top and bottom. So I always use it. I said, this is one of the pervasive effects. You know you're all wrong. We have regularity at both top and bottom. Now here's a personal experience. As a matter of fact, you look at our modern command and control systems, they tend to do that. I'll get into that later on. I don't want to preempt myself too much. There's a way we construct our command and control system that does impose irregularity. We say it isn't there, but it really is, and it causes some problems. Because we tend to articulate it in terms of our high technology. We can have all these fusion centers, communication centers. In order to make that work, people tend to do things in very rigid recipes. Go ahead.
Was the regularity at the bottom of their tactics imposed by the general, or was it sort of the chicken and the egg routine? They have rather low quality troops and so on and so
That's
forth.
just a preempt. I'm just going to talk about that. I'm just setting this up. I'm going to talk about it right now. Just hang on to the answer question. Now recall, we critiqued Napoleon, remember? We said, you know, he got hung up and said he tended to have the tactical regularity. We see the same thing. So the question is, why did this occur? Which is your question. There's a number of things you can offer. One, remember, even though we had the Napoleonic Revolution, which tended to pull these things apart, Napoleon later on reinstalled himself as emperor. Also, remember the period that both he, Clausewitz, and Jomini came out of. They came out in the 18th century, the eighth aristocracy, where they want to have adaptability at the top and regularity at the bottom. So in other words, they're imprinted by their culture. We tend to get, you don't even realize, you tend to get imprinted by your culture, then you make decisions based upon that culture. Let me give you an example. This is not going to be a charitable example. Sort of, I'm going to hit you over the shoulders with this one a little bit. People like ideology. I call it ideology. It's closer to being idiot. The reason being, if you use ideology as a screening device, then what you're doing is you're denying yourself the opportunity to see things from a different perspective. It's a filtering device. Well, if you've been imprinted by a culture, and you see things a certain way, that's another aspect you think is sort of an ideology too. So it's a screening device so you don't see things the other way. You've been imprinted. We're all imprinted by our culture. There has some certain value there. If you're not imprinted by a culture, you're going to be confused and disordered all your life. You have to have certain constancies and things in your life so you can deal with variety. But then if you impose those constancies in certain situations such that you can't adapt, then you tend to screen out things you need to know. Even Napoleon himself, who was a creature of the revolution, reinstalled the aristocracy, because remember, his culture is also from the 18th century, which is the aristocracy. You have to keep that in mind. There's some other features, I just wanted to bring that in. Another reason why you could say why Napoleon did, that's one thing, is remember, after he became emperor and he started conquering all his various countries and installing his own puppets or his own people there, as the case may be, he also depended upon these other countries for troop levies. And so then, in order to get them to work together, he started imposing more and more rigidity. In fact, you can go back to Frederick the Great. He said, hell, he didn't even like to march his army near a wood because he said half of them would desert. They want to keep them in formation. So they're concerned about their troops. So by putting that regularity on was to keep track of them, be sure they showed up for the battle or showed up for their assignment. I want you to keep that in mind. We'll come back to later on in different contexts. So these are the kind of things that are going on. The culture, the fact that these people didn't have a piece of the action. The only way you get them to do something is rather onerous and sharp techniques you use upon them. Uniformity or rigidity. But then when you do that, you also make yourself less adaptable, and also less predictable. More predictable. There's always, remember, you got to look at these things from different sides. You may get one benefit, but you also may get a detriment somewhere else. You want to keep track of that. You want to have values. You want to have things you believe in. But you want to think about those all the time. By doing this, hey, am I hosing myself over here? Do I have any workarounds? If I don't have any workarounds, I better start rethinking the problem. You can be committed to something. Remember, if you're going to do something, maybe some disadvantage, then you can say, well, maybe I can still retain that. I might have some workarounds. Still get me. You want to look for those. Just don't say bullshit. We're going to continue on. How many times have you been in a meeting where you've been in a discussion? This is an important point with people, and maybe a new idea comes out, and the guy says, "Oh, bullshit." He won't even think about it. See, he's got a structure in his mind And he's got a yes-no system there, and that thing didn't fit that, so he said, no, it's out, it's out. You know, he's evaluating according to the structure he's got in his mind. It may not even be the right context to evaluate it. You got to bring it on to you. Say, okay, let that guy talk a little bit. Let's see what that structure is. It might be valuable. And then again, it may be bullshit. I've seen people, we used to call him Dr. No. That's Dr. No. They always say no. Doesn't fit. It's imprinted in his brain. Oh, think about it for a while first. When you're doing it, you're being given the opportunity, maybe or maybe not, to look at something from a different vantage point, which means allow you to widen your variety, which means then you can use it for leverage. And if you're restricted to narrow your variety, somebody's going to leverage you then. Talk about that in the beginning. Very important. Okay. With that in mind, we find out there are a number of people who talked about war at that time, and some people were affected by the Napoleonic experience. One of these gentlemen was a guy by the name of Schalk, who's in the, you know, Schalk was affected here. He was actually in Philadelphia, note the date, Philadelphia. 1862, but he took all this stuff, he said he reduced the science of war to 3 great factors. Here they are, let's read it, his words. During the Civil War. Now, granted, one thing you want to keep in mind here, as we're working our way forward, so far, except when we talked about fighter pilots, we're tending to treat war, except for maybe the way Clausewitz looked at it. Remember, he looked at the psychological and the moral. We tend to think of it very much in a physical sense, or don't we? Very much in a physical sense, where he's describing. That's one thing. The other thing is caution. He really hasn't addressed it down. These are my words, down at the tactical level. He hasn't come to grips with the tactical level yet. The problems they've had. Okay? Okay, with that in mind, let's look at another impact of the 19th century. The so-called rise of modern technology.